And I think it's a question we're going to be dealing with for the next few years. But I think the more as people tell their stories, that's important. Our responsibility as media makers is to make sure we're not telling somebody else's story, but we're empowering them to tell their stories.
This is a panel called This is What Democracy Looks Like. And our panelists today are Hedrick Smith, a Pulitzer Prize-winning former New York Times reporter and editor, an Emmy Award-winning producer and correspondent. Chris Hastings, executive producer and editorial manager for the World Channel here at WGBH. T. Woody Richmond. Woody was the editor, co-writer, and co-producer of the Academy Award-nominated and critically acclaimed How to Survive a Plague. He co-produced and edited the Academy Award-nominated and Sundance Grand Jury Prize-winning documentary, Trouble the Water. And my friend Jody Rave Spotted Bear, who we're really lucky to have with us because she lives in North Dakota and just happens to be in New Hampshire this month for a stint at the MacDowell Colony while she's working on a book. She's a journalist and media entrepreneur and is working on a creative nonfiction book about the freedom of information, the oil industry, and the cultural impact on the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation. So this is a really big topic right now. As we all know, our world is consumed by conversations around the media. And I would argue, I think everyone in here would agree, that media has become the most important PowerPoint in our society today. And everyone's got one of these. And it's become both the most democratizing and dividing resource of our time. So with that, I just want to tell a little story. I was working on a film about women and democracy in Ukraine because a classmate of mine from the Kennedy School of Government and I were Skyping one day, and she became a member of parliament in Ukraine, and she said, there is a revolution going on in the streets here, and nobody knows about it. And she started talking about how they, as members of parliament, were expected to step forward and have the answers. And she said, I'm a trained economist. I have no idea what to do. And I said, you know, this is really interesting. Can I come follow you around with a camera? She said no several times until she finally said yes. And I was in Kiev with her, and we stepped out of an elevator at this very fancy hotel next to the Verkhovna Rada, which is the parliament building in Kiev. And Howard Dean was standing there, and I was totally shocked and surprised. I was like, what is Howard Dean doing here? And this was right after the invasion of Crimea in Ukraine. And he was there with NDI and said, you know, he granted us an interview. Sat down with him and had him and Olga sitting together and talked for about an hour. And the one thing that I really remember most succinctly is when he said, you know, I'm here because we're trying to shore up the foundations of the democratic systems in this country, which is rife with corruption and tending toward oligarchic systems. And I said, well, what would you like the American people to know? And he said, we as Americans are really good at the rights part, but democracy is made of rights and responsibilities. And while we're very good at clamoring for our rights in this country, we're not so good at upholding the responsibilities of what it takes as citizens and, I would say, for us as media makers, in maintaining the democratic systems that are how we form our society and our democracy. So with that, I would like to turn it to our panelists and say, who would like to start off to talk about what do you believe are the responsibilities that we may have as citizens, but especially as citizens who are media makers as well in our society today, or in our role as in the work that we do?
Well, I'll take a whack. I love the fact that you're telling your story in the Ukraine. I believe we have a responsibility to report on democracy, and particularly democracy at the grassroots. You were there at the grassroots of a rebellion. If we look at the media today, American media, it's dominated by Washington coverage, which is focused on Trump, anti-Trump, or the Democratic presidential nomination race. And it's doing almost nothing to cover, or very little to cover democracy at the grassroots. I'm one of those guys who's been a foreign reporter in a lot of places, and I learned in Russia, in Cairo, in Saigon, that if I was going to cover the country, I had to get out. So I think one of the things we have to do is we have to get out of our zone of comfort. We have to get out of where we normally operate and get out among the people. And if you do that in America today, we've got a film coming on PBS called The Democracy Rebellion. It's about grassroots action in states as varied as South Dakota and North Carolina, as Florida, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Michigan. I mean, all over the place. There's a lot going on, and people don't know about it. Because the mainstream media is so focused on this binary idea that politics is all one party versus the other. It's all Trump versus either pro-Trump or anti-Trump. And we're not exercising our responsibility. We're not covering democracy. We're not showing, in fact, what's going on. We're missing a great story. And I think we need to get out there and do that. No question about it. But you did it because you were there physically. You have to get there physically. I mean, you see the media used in the rebellion in Ukraine, or the rebellion in Cairo, or in the Arab countries in Tunisia, or you see it now being used in Lebanon, you see it being used in Hong Kong. It's because the reporters and the media are there among the people who are taking action at the grassroots. And that's critical.
I want to throw this to Jody, because she was there at Standing Rock when this turned on a dime for, you mentioned South Dakota, so I'm just going to throw it to Jody first. She's from North Dakota, and Standing Rock is in South Dakota, and it's a very geographically isolated space, which normally would not have the access to media centers. So would you tell us what your experience was there in response?
Yeah, Standing Rock actually straddles the North Dakota and South Dakota border, and I had went there. Part of that information will be in the book that I'm working on right now. So we talk about you have to go into the communities where the action is, and minority communities are vastly underreported in the United States, and I'll get to Standing Rock here in a second. I just want to mention the work that the Borealis Philanthropy had just launched, a racial equity in journalism fund, and that is because of all the media, of the billions of dollars that go to media foundations, only 6% of that money was making it to communities of color. And so how this ties in with Standing Rock is the world would not have known what was happening in Standing Rock, because a lot of the major media organizations didn't come in with their satellite dishes until the very tail end of that. But the rest of the world, we were finding out what was happening, and those of us that actually were there on the ground, is through social media. And having been in the camps, I would see, you got to know who the people were that had the largest following on, like Linda Black Elk was one of the thousands of people that were following her Facebook and social media feeds. So anyway, I could go on about that, but I'll back off.
You had?
Yeah, I was just going to riff off of what you were saying in terms of people being embedded or within the news that's going on. I've had the chance to work on a couple of films in which the people who are featured in the film actually shot a bunch of the film. And can I show that clip?
Let's.
So there's
are
a
we queued
clip
up to
I'd like to show. It's from a movie called How to Survive a Plague, and the movie is about early AIDS treatment activists, and they were operating in a time where really there was no cure for the disease. No one knew. No one cared about the people who were having the disease. Coincidentally, AIDS came about around the same time as camcorders. So a lot of the people who were afflicted also happened to be artists, so they had camcorders and they started shooting their own stuff. And now that we all have these in our pockets, we can shoot our own stuff. So this is a grassroots action. It's from 1992. Nothing was going on. It was right before the election. Bush won versus Clinton. And the AIDS quilt was in Washington, D.C., and the group ACT UP decided not just the AIDS quilt, which makes everything sort of nice and pretty, but we're going to do something bigger and more dramatic and to get out there. I would be interested to know how the news actually reported, but we're going to show you something that was shot by people who were also activists. Can you roll that clip?
Steve H. My friend.
You can crank it up a little bit.
David Evans, Nicholas Kaiser,
Sorry, it's ST.
George Marshall, and my beloved brother, Dennis J.
Robert R. Hackett, Philip Gregory Ellison, Terry Ronan,
Michael Bennett,
Donald Redd,
Ron Field, Tina Chow, Perry Ellis, Freddie Mercury, Peter Allen, to the thousands of other people who were made to suffer in silence.
Join ACT UP for a political funeral. Meet at the steps of the Capitol at 1 p.m. Give a wake-up call to George Bush and Bill Clinton in Peru.
I think the quilt itself does good stuff and is moving. Still, it's like making something beautiful out of the epidemic. And I felt like doing something like this is a way of showing there's nothing beautiful about it. You know, this is what I'm left with. I've got a box full of ashes and bone chips. You know, there's no beauty in that. And I felt like a statement like this is like saying this is what George Bush has done. You know, this is what him and Ronald Reagan before him have done. These are our loved ones, and this is what they've been reduced to, and we're bringing them to the person who's responsible for their death.
Welcome to the first of 3 debates among the major candidates for President of the United States, sponsored by the Commission on Presidential Debates.
Mr. President, yesterday, tens of thousands of people paraded past the White House to demonstrate their concern about the disease AIDS.
So that's pretty,
celebrated
you know,
member of
it's
your
shaky. I see a couple of tears. I've watched that 1,000 times, and I still. I just also like to recognize one of the people who shot that was citizen activist Tim McCarthy from Provincetown, who's no longer with us, died about a year ago today. But anyhow, there's an example of an action, a grassroots action, shot by the people who were there. 20 years later, you know, edited by someone who wishes he was there helping. But I have a question, like, I'm sure that was on the news, but how was it presented? Was it presented as a loving thing or as a terrorist act of people throwing ashes on the White House lawn? So even if you have someone there, who's making the choice of how to report it, you know?
Well, that goes to the question of gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And the lack of diverse gatekeepers across the board, no matter what media organization is there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as we think about what our responsibility as creators and gatekeepers, we have to also really keep in mind that representation is important, and that gets pushed to the side a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
It's a question that's, when you think about how that might have been presented, I don't remember.
Yeah.
But I would say it probably was presented as a protest.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't necessarily presented as in the way this was presented. But this is important because the news media wasn't, you know, they weren't that close.
Yeah.
They were behind a wall, you know?
Yeah.
And so the fact that they had the power to open the camcorder and tell their story, that's important. You know, when you look at Ferguson, you look at Standing Rock, you look at Egypt a few years ago, we learned about those things because of the people on the ground.
Yeah.
They didn't wait for the gatekeepers to come in. They empowered themselves to pick up their cameras and their camcorders, and they just told their story. Now, on the other side of it, you know, the question is, who in 2020 is going to let those stories get out to you? You know, there's a lot of conversations about Facebook and Twitter, and you know, and the fact that in terms of political speech and whatnot, there's questions there about should there be gatekeepers stopping media from coming in, and so the big conversation about all this is who are the gatekeepers serving? How is it going to help this community? And I think it's a question we're going to be dealing with for the next few years. But I think the more as people tell their stories, that's important. Our responsibility as media makers is to make sure we're not telling somebody else's story, but we're empowering them to tell their stories.
That's a really good point. That brings up back the question of
You know, it's striking to me, you're talking about the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
I made this documentary, The Democracy Rebellion. We actually went to MSNBC with it. And they held it for about 6 months and didn't run it. They contracted with us, and they contracted for some others, for other documenters that were about grassroots activities. None of them ran. And when you scratched the surface and looked at it, the reason was they were making so much money from Trump news, either
Right.
pro or anti-Trump news. And it didn't have to be just Trump. It could be Jared Kushner. It could be Khashoggi's killing. It could be whatever it was, that they didn't have, quote, time to run the other story.
this
So,
week,
I mean,
how many
it's-
of us were watching the news looking for news about the fires in California? Anybody else? It was very difficult to find any news being broadcast about what was happening with these horrible fires in California. Same thing. It was just wall to wall, over and over iterations of the Trump question.
Can I show you something, a clip, because it starts in Washington, D.C.
Sure.
This film starts in Washington, D.C. It got almost no coverage.
you
Can we show a little bit of a clip here?
200 years ago, we had an American Revolution to make sure that we got democracy in this country. Well, today starts the new American Revolution.
El día de hoy empieza la nueva revolución
To make
americana.
sure that we get our democracy back.
Que tomemos nuestra democracia nuevamente.
So, brothers and sisters, are you ready to stand up?
¿Están listos para levantarse?
Are you ready to fight?
¿Están listos para luchar?
Are you ready to march?
Yes, we can! Yes, we can!
Democracy awakening, they call it. Thousands of protesters massing in Washington. All over the country, Americans are fed up. And rebelling against the politicians and the power brokers.
I believe that we will win!
Fighting against Citizens United.
We do not believe that corporations are people.
Voter suppression.
We will never stop battling.
Dark money.
The money was hopping from one nonprofit to another, all for the purpose of concealing donors.
Gerrymandering.
The real work on redistricting was being done behind closed doors.
Pressing for reform.
If this singing and these chants up on the Capitol steps remind you of the civil rights movement, it should. This is Americans protesting, in this case against big money in politics, for voting rights, against gerrymandering, against a broken political system.
It's the kind of story I've seen before. In the 1960s, I covered the civil rights protests in the Deep South, reported on the Vietnam War in Saigon, the Cold War and Gorbachev's perestroika from Moscow, and covered 6 American presidents. Today, partisan gridlock blocks change in Washington. And so once again, the grassroots are riled up and rising up, state by state.
We need to put the power of the vote back into the hands of the people.
Linda Bach is a modern Paul Revere, awakening the popular rebellion. She collected 21,000 signatures to help put Initiative I-735 on the 2016 ballot.
I've long had the idea that I am continuing the American Revolution. Every signature I get is just another check for the Constitution and the power of we the people. Democracy, you must fight for it or it'll slip right out of your hands.
The point was this piece, this demonstration, all those thousands of people were demonstrating at the Capitol. 400 or 500 of them got arrested. It got absolutely no coverage on the networks and on cable TV. It was as if it didn't happen. I got to tell you, I covered the civil rights movement in the 60s, and it was not the same. I mean, the demonstrations in Birmingham or Albany, Georgia, or Jackson, Mississippi, there has been a real shift in the attention of the mainstream.
More coverage.
Yeah. It got covered all the time. In fact, it was the national coverage of the police dogs and the fire hoses being used on black kids who were demonstrating in downtown Birmingham that turned the situation around in Birmingham. I mean, it was absolutely critical. So the interplay, just the point you were making earlier, the interplay between the media and the point that Woody was making, the interplay, and the point you were making, Tony, the awareness of what was going on at Standing Rock was absolutely critical to how it was going to move forward politically. And the media role, and particularly pictures, particularly video, is absolutely critical.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, when we compare the 60s to today, you know, in the 60s you had, you know, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and the newspapers. And so it was a limited number of distributors. And so I think when we see protests like this, I would hope when that protest happened that, you know, like the clip you showed, that it probably made a buzz on social media where it did not make a buzz on the mainstream media. I think we're in a time where mainstream media almost is kind of less important in the immediate. What is important, I think, and I'm going to go back to my point, that we need to empower our citizens to capture these stories and push them out there quickly. Because, you know, Standing Rock, it was going on a long time before the mass media picked up on it. Ferguson was going on a long time before the mass media picked up on it. And it's important, I think, in this conversation to understand that the mass media, the legacy media, I would call it, they're distracted. And so as citizens, I think the power is in us all to just tell our story. Don't wait for the media to come and tell the story. just empower these young kids to be journalists, to be citizen journalists, to be, the gatekeeper, to just get it out there. And so I would bet, when this protest was going on, it probably had a buzz, on YouTube. It probably had a buzz on Instagram. It probably had a buzz in spaces where it was important to somebody. But the mass media didn't pick up on it. They're not going to cover it. They're distracted.
Jody brought up something earlier to your point about, we were talking before we came out here, about the importance of the Fourth Estate and in maintaining the guardrails of fact-checking. And that's something that we're all seeing as being critical right now, right? So Jody, would you like to give us a little bit of that taste of what you were talking about with the importance of, you're a longtime journalist and you've represented Indian country in major media. Jody was the Native American reporter for Lee Enterprises, which was then bought by Pulitzer. So her weekly stories were in newspapers all over the country covering Indian country as a Native American. So she was one of the first who was empowered within major media to do so. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, about grassroots. We were just talking about the fact-checking and how we train our citizen journalists.
Well, it's so with this onslaught of citizen journalists, which is important, you also need journalism organizations to help vet those stories or have trained citizen journalists, because, going back to Standing Rock, you had a lot of people presenting, live streaming, real-time news. And a lot of these people the majority of people weren't journalists. And so you also had news streaming, and being somebody that lives in North Dakota and was familiar with the issues, and I was in the camp, I would see some of these feeds and it's like, wow, this is so wrong, and this is a lot of misinformation. But at that point, these citizen journalists were kind of considered the news makers, and so I was alarmed knowing that, probably thousands of people were watching these feeds, and it was wrong. So that was one of the reasons that I founded the Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance, and we publish our news on Buffalo's Fire. But we're trying to create video news teams so we get daily news out there on a regular basis. We have an extreme news desert in Indian country. So the majority of our media, the print and radio, is owned by tribal governments. So if you could just imagine, if the government controlled more than half of your media in Indian country, it's between 60 and 70%. So we have a real information void. And so it's really imperative that we create independent media organizations. But going back to that point I made earlier, where the gatekeepers, the foundation folks that are controlling all the money going to nonprofit media organizations, again, only 6% of that money is going to newsrooms led by people of color. So we've really got to amp up those efforts to train the people that are telling, that should be having the voice in these communities.
Mm-hmm. Woody, did you look like you wanted to jump in there? Is there something you'd like to say?
I think she's made a very important point, and it really ties in with what you were saying a few moments ago. We need a combination of the entrepreneurship and the freedom and the spontaneity of people who are on the scene or who are simply, as you were, not as a citizen journalist. You were there as a journalist in Ukraine, so you took advantage of the situation you were in. But you need that you need the tentacles, you need the exploration, the sense of curiosity, adventure, and discovery that you get from either the citizens who are on the scene or curious journalists. But then you also need, picking up on your point, you also need some discipline about fact-checking and cross-checking and organizing a story into something that's coherent. I mean, as you said, these films were shot 20 years ago, and then somebody edited it, namely you. But the way you edited it was not irrelevant to the power of what happened. So just taking the raw footage. And when we did this stuff on the Democracy Rebellion, we went back into situations that had occurred 2 or 3 years before we were on the scene. Happily, there were people there who had taken footage, so we were able to use their footage. But you needed to take their footage and then bring it forward and make it into a story that was coherent and help people understand the situation, which you couldn't quite get from most of the total amateurs, maybe some of them, but I mean, you sort of need that combination.
So I was going to say, if you could talk a little bit about when you were saying for the How to Survive a Plague, Woody pointed out earlier that part of the reason that he had this footage to work with was that it's the artists who are all of us, right, the media makers, who have access to both the story and the wherewithal to make the story happen, to create some kind of media. And you were talking about how nowadays it's become democratized, but we still have this group of people who specialize in it. What would you say about what's the response? Is there a responsibility for us to call on our fellow media makers, or is this just too much to ask, that we should just really let journalists be journalists and media makers make movies and do what they want?
Something you were mentioning before, that in the past there was, CBS, ABC, NBC, there were Walter Cronkite people, there were Murrow people, so today, I mean, that's the thing, our news media we still have the big three, and then we have, Fox, CNN, and MSNBC. But if it bleeds, it leads. If it sells ads, it's on. The piece you're talking about is get money out of politics. Well, maybe get money out of news too. I think,
or the profit motive. You got to have money with it. But if the profit motive, if eyeballs is driving it, then you got it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
And you don't cover the Standing Rock. You don't cover those demonstrations.
And ultimately, I mean, the thing, you use the example of the fire hoses. That's kind of, if it bleeds, it leads, right? That was exciting, more exciting than let's get money out of politics. You know what I mean? It's not more important. Or maybe it is, but my point is, the gatekeepers again. We're talking about the gatekeepers and what they decide should be on.
But the irony is, when you're talking about gatekeepers, you're going back and hailing an era where there were few gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And you're sort of saying it was better than, now we have 100 channels, we have 500 channels, we have 1,000 channels. That hasn't helped.
But
we've multiplied the number of gatekeepers, but it hasn't really opened up the media.
You're not saying
kind
it was
of an
better,
irony.
It hasn't opened up the traditional legacy media. I think it's opened up the possibility that you have alternative forms of media, alternative places for people to get their media, and that's happened.
Sure.
We're beyond, the legacy standpoint, but I think what is hard for me to wrap my head around with all these places and all these gatekeepers, there's still a gap between who gets to get their story out there and gets represented.
Sure.
And so part of what I'm trying to get us to sort of think about is that we have to really empower communities that aren't being represented to be part of the dialogue, because the legacy media isn't going to go there unless it bleeds, but there are other places and other ways and methods for underrepresented communities to tell their stories. And so in some ways, I'm sort of making an argument that what we as media makers can do is really think about representation, and when you're telling a story and you're going to go be a journalist or you're going to be a media maker, making sure that there's representation on how it's getting told. And in terms of the gatekeepers, look for alternative places to get it out.
How do we get, I love pinball, right?
Right.
So I'm going to be watching pinball stuff, but if you guys don't like pinball, you're not watching pinball stuff, but I would really like people to like pinball. So I want people who don't like pinball to watch pinball stuff. So, I mean, how do we, if we've got these specialty groups, how do we because telling stories to ourselves is one thing, but how do we tell stories, how do we get your stories to the people who will give money to your organization to make the change that needs to happen? How do we tell the underrepresented stories to the to the people who watch the overrepresented stories? You know what I mean? I guess what I'm saying is, I agree with you that it's important for people who are underrepresented to tell our stories, but how do we then push it?
In some ways, we have to be the advocate for people who might not know how to tell that story. And so it means if we're going to go and tell a story, go to that community, figure out who is the most able and willing to help you tell that story.
I get that part.
Yeah.
I'm saying distribution of that story, getting that out to people who aren't already interested in that topic, aren't already part of that group, how do we make that next step?
Well, YouTube and the social media are certainly the outlet. You know, it seems to me that we're actually here at a pregnant time. We're here at a time when, if you look at any kind of poll about any issue, Americans are troubled.
Right.
70–80% will say Washington's not paying any attention to people like me. Lobbyists have too much power. Corporations have taken over Washington. Right. The media is controlled by money. I mean, I don't care where you go. The public is ready to have some adventure to discover some of the communities that are underserved, and to look at some of the issues that are, I mean, look at the interest there was on putting kids in cages along the border. I mean, once you saw that, the public really glommed onto it. There are all kinds of things that are wrong in this country now, and the public is more in a frame of mind to be receptive. Right. Part of it is that whatever you're in, whether you're running a channel that's deciding what goes on the air, or Woody, you're editing something, or you're creating a new book, or I'm doing a documentary, it's up to us to be more imaginative and to reach out further. You're fortunate. You're coming from a community that you're sitting there. Me, I got to get up out of my chair and I've got to go to another world. You know, I go back to this idea of your experience in Ukraine. The idea, if you're a foreign correspondent, you are there to discover a world that you don't know anything about. There's an attitude that you have to learn about a community that's not yours. You have to learn a language, you have to learn a religion, you have to learn a political structure, you have to learn. We have this notion that, we know about America. We don't have to do that. And I think part of it is we really have to fire up our own imagination, our own ambition, and kick ourselves in the butt to get out of the comfort zones that we're in. And I think part of it is really, we don't really honestly admit that. Now, we're sitting here as an odd panel if you listen to who's here. Mm-hmm. But if you had a panel of 5 journalists in Washington, they'd be sitting there very comfortably talking about whatever happened yesterday and what the president said or didn't say about killing of al-Baghdadi, and we'd be learning nothing. Well, so, I mean, part of it is to stimulate those organizations. And you can knock legacy journalism, what it's going to do or not going to do, but we need to keep kicking them. That it's failing, and we as an audience need to say, with our clickers, we need to go somewhere else.
And they are.
Yeah.
And they are.
Yeah. That's good.
I mean, I think that's the kicking them, and that's the sort of empowering thing about where we are right now, is that the alternative platforms, they're there. Some of them are funded, some of them aren't. You talked about some of the nonprofits that aren't getting the money from, that needs to be called out more. But I think as you think about what's on the other side of the pregnancy is, there's going to be a lot of media, and some of it's going to be unfiltered. But the hope that we can hope for, I think, is that some of these sort of emerging platforms will get some play. They're not going to get the same eyeballs as the legacy media of the past, but there's a new sort of thing happening.
Well, let's talk about how that translates into democratic systems, because I think that's a critical moment to be talking about that. To Hedrick's point about how this translates into Washington, D.C., for those of you paying attention, you would probably know that there has been an order that's come down because of the success of AOC and other progressives who've challenged longtime incumbents and beaten them. There has been an order that's come down to shut down the means by which the the system works to get people elected to office, all those consultants and the other groups that help campaign managers to sign an agreement not to help progressive challengers during this campaign cycle. For those of you who are paying attention will know, some of you might not know, but there is a concerted, overt movement right now by the DCCC, and by our Democratic establishment to shut down that progress. Why? Obviously why? Because they're saying the House is on fire, our republic is at risk, that all the energy needs to go into saving the republic and shoring up our democracy. At the same time, what it's doing is essentially shutting down robust debate within our Democratic Party and with it amongst our progressives and other folks on that side. Now, I was hoping we could maybe have a conversation about that. We're obviously, this is a lot to talk about, and we only have an hour, so we're just kind of hopefully opening up your ideas about how you might become engaged more robustly in your own work, whether it's as an individual and what you're doing in your own social media life, or as a professional and how you engage with your colleagues or with your institutions, just to kind of start to see things with a little bit more color, and as far as the spectrum of what we need to continue to shore up our democratic systems and how media plays that role. But going back to the AOC question, she won. I've been told that in kind of trying to get to the bottom of this story of what's happening with shutting down challengers to incumbent members of Congress right now. Well, it costs $1 million if you want to run for Congress. If you can't raise $1 million, you are not a viable candidate. Until you're a viable candidate, you get ignored by everyone. Now, what is that $1 million for? It's for media buys. So it becomes the system, right? We're all part of that same system. But AOC did it with $300,000. How did she do that? Because she did it through alternative media, and she had the support of these grassroots systems of brand new Congress and Justice Democrats. So I would love for the panel to kind of take this on. Maybe Hedrick, we could start with you about what does this mean for our role, being we're part of that ecosystem for our democracy, for elections, for if we want change in Washington, D.C., et cetera. We're part of that ecosystem as being the media, whether it's reporting on it or people buying political ads. What do you think?
I have to go back to the point I made at the beginning, and that is get the hell out of Washington, get out to the state. No, I'm serious. I mean, if you want to talk about AOC, she really mastered a district. But there are other people who are doing it too around the country. I don't think the political stripe matters. I think that what matters is that there's enormous ferment in this country on issue after issue. And we're only going to share that with the public if we get out and find out about it and report about it. And what's amazing is how little of it jumps across state lines. I mean, if there's a push for public funding of campaigns in South Dakota, remarkably, it was followed by a push for public funding and for other reforms in North Dakota. And that's the only example I can think of. And I've been in about 20 states over the last 2 or 3 years. It's the only example I can think of where one state learned from another. We're doing all this, at home in our, there's this issue, Standing Rock. Then there's the protests about the people with the ashes. And so it's somehow, we're not connecting in ways. And that's our role in the media. We're the connectors. We're the people who can carry a story from Ghent to Aix, as the poem used to say. We're the people who can share the triumphs. Part of it is, I think there's an enormous sense of defeat in this country. I have a friend named Ernie Cortez, who's an organizer in the Southwest, a Hispanic organizer. And he said to me, Rick, people say power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. But he said powerlessness also corrupts. Powerlessness corrupts democracy at the core. If people don't feel they can exercise their power, they disempower themselves. Part of what we need to do in the media is re-empower ourselves, but we also need to help re-empower other people who are out there. They're out there, and if we tell their stories, that multiplies. There's a multiplier effect. I mean, I have to tell you, I'm blown away by some of the things I saw. And I've worked in Russia. I've worked in 30 or 40 different countries. When I saw public funding of campaigns in Connecticut, take a woman who had grown up in poverty, had children when she was young, had been on food stamps, was running a nonprofit for African American women who have breast cancer. She can suddenly run for office because there's public funding of campaigns in Connecticut. She gets elected. She is now in her fourth term, and she's chairman of the Health and Social Services Committee of the state legislature. Now, I mean, that's an empowerment that's unbelievable, but simply telling that story and showing that story to people in 50 states, people say, oh my God, it isn't just nice, clean elections we want. We can actually change the way, the dynamics of power by changing who's sitting in the seats. And we can do that with reform, and the reform came out because of public pressure. So, I mean, it seems to me there's success, courage, reform, ferment is contagious. And we're the spreaders of the contagion. God, forgive me. What a moment, you know. Sorry, Mr. Trump, I can't talk. Excuse me, there's an editor working on the film.
Your light's on.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, my point is it's contagious and it's getting out there. You know, whether or not the issue is progressivism versus conservative establishment, the point is from the bottom up. We're a bottom up country. We love underdogs. We in the media, you know, this is great for us. We should be working on covering underdogs.
Right. But that's the power of the democracy that we all have, right? As media makers, I'm hoping that we can all walk out of here today with a renewed sense of optimism and energized, right? So that we can all realize that we all have the power, especially in the roles that we play in our genre here, in our industry, that we can actually make a difference. That we are the people who have the power to open the gates, to push for campaign reform laws by telling those stories, to help with empowering folks who are not empowered, to help get the money to the folks who don't have the money, to bring the media into the media deserts, that's something that we all can do. And it doesn't mean you have to do it all, but just pick something, pick at least just one thing that you might change in the way that you're doing your daily life or you're doing your daily work within wherever, you just start where you are. You don't have to be the CEO of some big media company, you just start where you are. I believe in granular democracy and I believe in granular media, so.
Yeah, I think that we should be, as Hedrick had mentioned, paying attention to the underdogs, and that's where the media makers can go in and who's running in your districts, who are the people that you don't expect to win. I think we have a really good example in North Dakota with Ruth Buffalo. So I did a story recently about the comparing the districts between Montana, the legislative districts between Montana and North Dakota. Montana has about 11 American Indians sitting in the state legislature. Their population base is on par with the legislative representatives, but in North Dakota, there is there are now 2 American Indians in the state legislature. Ruth Buffalo is a really good story of the underdog in that because our legislative districts don't include the population bases of the reservations, we get very little people from like my reservation, Fort Berthold. We probably had one person in the whole history of the state get elected to the legislature. Ruth is from my reservation, but she lives on the other side of the state in Fargo. But she just ran a really grassroots-driven campaign. She knocked on about 7,000 doors, and she won her election. American Indian woman on the other side of the state in a very large populated city. But tell those stories of the people that have a good story to tell.
We have about 6 minutes left. Do we have any questions? So I saw you first.
Thank you for being here, first and foremost. I'm wondering about kind of the other side of the equation, the audience. I think now that the number of contents available and the way we can consume it is so democratized. One of the things I'm kind of finding is that information like little pieces of news, citizen news that goes out doesn't actually, sometimes doesn't connect in a way that like doesn't spur interaction. It more just kind of feeds within the same silo. So a progressive piece of news get kind of stuck within that, and more so even that, you know, if it kind of goes out, let's talk about like a new piece of news that AOC puts out might actually get twisted and changed by the conservatives to something else different, and that kind of feeds its own different cycles, and people aren't talking. It's more people just kind of talking amongst each other but not to each other, and that to a point it's also feeding the concept that like, oh, if it's someone else saying certain things then it's a lie, it's not true, it's fake news, that kind of thing. So how do you engage a landscape that's kind of going in this direction as media creators?
I mean, I think it's a deeper problem than necessarily media creators can solve. I feel like, you know, what's the percentage of schools that now have civics, civics classes? I mean, there's a responsibility that I think is upon all of us as consumers of media to, since it's become so split and specialized, like we need to listen to things outside of our silo. Like we need to make an effort to watch the Fox News channel and MSNBC and read the Boston Globe. You know what I mean? We need, because we need to be able to see how the same thing's being presented in various ways to sort of gauge the truth. And I think that's always been, my granddad definitely tried to read 3 different newspapers because he knew that there was one newspaper that spun it this way and another one spun it that way, and then there was one that was sort of in the middle, but you know, wanted to see. So I think we need to do that. But that was what I was getting at earlier about, like, you know, silos. You know, we're making stuff. Are we preaching to the choir? Like, I work on a Michael Moore film. How many people who don't already agree with 80% of what he says are going to go see that movie, you know? I don't know.
You have to make a pinball movie.
Yeah.
Somebody way up there.
Or a pinball machine about a documentary.
Yep. Sorry.
Okay. Hi. One of the things that I've noticed, sort of an irony here because it wasn't covered, but there were radio stations and newspapers that I like WILD for the African American community, and Tom Joyner, same thing. All of a sudden, like, disappeared. Like, ILD disappeared like that. And we didn't have anything, and it did a lot of news. And then Tom Joyner, I said, well, can't have that. At least I can go online and get Tom Joyner. Disappeared. And so, on the one hand, we're not getting that news. I mean, I guess you have to search and find it another way, but they just like disappear and there's no coverage of it. But the flip side of that is I had some friends that are not people of color, and they were only listening to sound bites because that's other stuff. And I said, they talk about something like, say, oh, sore loserman. Like, I can't believe I said, well, you know what? Here is the other side of that. And absolutely surprised, like somebody that's nice, but absolutely surprised that there was another side, another way of thinking. It's sort of like what this other person was saying about only hearing one side. But we're not even having an opportunity to get the other side if they just keep like getting rid of these radio stations. We used to have the basic banner is still around, but a lot of people don't know that it exists, and it isn't coming into our homes the way it used to. And so I think that changes quite a bit when we're not able to even get the news that we used to be able to get. Now we're like less and less able to get.
Chris, do you want to say something to that?
I mean, I think that really does speak to this idea of funding platforms, particularly diverse platforms, where they're curating news that are of interest to you, and it's trusted. And so, you know, I go back to the 6%. You know, there's a lot of money in journalism, and there's a lot of money into building platforms. But that new money isn't going to diverse platforms that are trusted to be distributors of content for you. And that's really a hard sort of thing to understand. I mean, I'm here trying to play devil's advocate because, I represent a legacy institution, and when we think about what should be funded and what shouldn't be funded, this question of funding platforms that aren't necessarily legacy institutions, that aren't necessarily speaking to diverse audiences, that's a big question, and I think it's important, as you think about this of what your responsibility is, if you think there's a platform that should be funded, it's important that you as citizens speak up about it, because I think there's this tug of war that's going on about where money goes to save journalism. And so you really picked up on something that's just the thread here. It's like
the funding question's a big question. It's a really big question. Jody and I met when my ex and I published a newspaper called The Native Voice, and one of the reasons we closed, we were in business from 2001 to 2008, 9, and things got very difficult when the Bush administration changed the rules about how certain government funding could be spent, and they closed down the ability to use government funding that went to places like public service, public safety on the reservations. They could no longer do media buys with that money. So there was a consolidation of media that happened during that period, and concurrently a shutting down of how you could spend certain government funding in terms of supporting independent local media. And so I don't know if it was intentional, but it certainly had a chilling effect on a lot of independent media outlets, because that was a big part of our budget, right? That was a big part of our income. Office of National Drug Control Policy did these full-page, full-color ads. Remember Parents, the Anti-Drug, things like that. Those all got shut down. And so when that went away, it just goes to show you how much, where the money goes, the energy follows. And so, is it a time to revisit in this administration? It's very difficult, but is it a time to revisit the importance of public funding for media outlets to be able to support alternative voices?
You've just hit on a really big issue, because what you're really talking about is, you're talking about the availability of funding. In the last 10 or 15 years, the amount of money going into journalism has gone down enormously. There are all kinds of news organizations that have shut down. What you're talking about is media consolidation back there. I remember one day running into a friend of mine who was on the CNN science team. He was a reporter-producer. And I asked him how he was. He looked terrible. He said, "I just got fired." He said, "They fired the entire science unit, 6 people." That doesn't mean that CNN isn't going to cover science anymore. It's just going to toss a breaking science story to a reporter who doesn't know anything about it. And they're going to rewrite the press handout they've been giving. And that's what's happening all through the media, which is one of the reasons why these alternative media have become so important, because that's the only place where you can go get specialized information. But so, I mean, we may have to start to think at some point beyond what you were talking about and your specific publication as to whether or not news is a public utility and needs to somehow be protected both in tax terms and maybe support. We need to figure out whether or not there needs to be a running affiliation between universities, libraries, and at least NPR and PBS, that is nonprofits in the public sphere working in the public interest. I mean, I think we're also stuck with a generation that thinks news is free, that it doesn't cost anything to generate the news. I mean, you've got Yahoo and you've got Facebook, you've got other places. Facebook's just made a deal, big deal with the news media. They're going to pay them several $1 million for the right to tap the Washington Post and New York. It's a joke. If you want to get a breaking investigative story, it's like creating a documentary. You're going to hire and commit reporters to it for 2, 3, 4 months. That single story is going to cost you $100,000. Do you think there's any way that anything but a very rich media organization, a very successful media organization, can do that? So the disappearance of those specific people, whom I don't happen to know, but those specific people is a reflection of the shrinkage of news as a whole. And it's also, you get the 7/24 news cycle, and you get Washington, and you get a monolithic, you get monochromatic news. So if we're going to break out of that, aside from having really great entrepreneurs and really wise gatekeepers like the guy sitting next to me, who are reaching out, we're going to have to find a way as a society to invest much more money in getting the information we need for a democracy to operate. That's a big deal.
I think a quick call to action is to support nonprofit media organizations. You can go to the Institute of Nonprofit News, and there's probably at least 170 nonprofit news organizations. So as we see the consolidation or the downsizing of the legacy press, our media organizations, you are seeing a rise in nonprofit media. But again, funding is always an issue. Our minority presses aren't getting that. But overall, as individual donors, quit expecting news for free and start supporting the people that specialize in telling these stories and are doing a good job at it.
So another question? Sorry? There was.
We don't want
do you have a question? Do you have a question? I'm sorry. Okay.
First of all, thank all of you for what you're sharing, because it's incredibly important. And thank you for the Mass Media Expo to have this talk. But just to follow up, I loved your suggestion about the Institute for Nonprofit News, and maybe for Chris, what are some other platforms you can suggest? So for those of us who've been brought up on legacy news and are trying to branch out, but it's like the Wild West, where should we start to look?
First of all, before you go there, I just want to give a shout out to public broadcasting and to WGBH for continuing this legacy. It was a profound thing for me, being an East Coast girl, to move out and to the reservation. I lived there a long time, and in South Dakota, in the middle of nowhere, you don't even have to have internet, you don't have to have satellite, you don't have to have cable. You can still put a rabbit ears on your television and pick up public broadcasting. Because, and I'm speaking, this was 10 years ago, so I hope that's still true. But there are relays up on towers all over this country to make sure that public broadcasting is in every home. So that's a good place to start. But I want to give you guys a chance to answer that question.
Start local. There are a lot of national organizations that are trying to tell stories, but I think one of the things that I try to remind people is that your local PBS, your local NPR, they have really big newsrooms and they are covering your local communities. And so I'm not going to necessarily mention specific names, but I think wherever you're from, start local, because they're putting efforts into covering news, covering your community. Anything?
Do we have time for one more? Burning question. Oh, it's so hard. There's so many people. So there's someone back there who's got their hand up going like this.
I'm glad you finally said something about local news. Believe it or not, we have a news desert in Newton, one of the largest cities in Massachusetts, 90,000 people. The biggest local newspaper, The Tab, was published. Their only publication this week before the election didn't use the word election once. It's unbelievable. And I started a Facebook group just to get the basic debate videos out. I'm the only one publishing the debate videos. It's just unbelievable.
Do you have a question for us?
Well, so the question is, what do you do about local news? Like, what can you do? I mean, you spoke about some things about maybe we need a partnership between universities and stuff. No offense to WBUR. I'm in your WBUR ed group. There's not one talk.
This is WGBH.
Sorry, I was getting maybe okay.
Go
I'm
look.
in that ed group. We've got a teacher's strike brewing, 15 months. No one's covering that. And so my Facebook group is, what can we do to get local news going? No one wants to do it.
Go look on the internet for an organization called Banyan, Banyan. I think it's in Lowell. It's a community-supported, nonprofit local news organization that started up about 4 or 5 years ago by some journalists who were thrown out of work because their organization got shut down or taken over, and so they set it up. But they set it up as community support. You not only subscribe, you support it. but that's something that can be adopted or maybe extended. But that's a very good organization, and there are organizations like that. I think that must be among the 130 or so you're talking about.
But I would also say, you know, if your local outlet, if WGBH News isn't covering something you think they should, I think one of the great things about news organizations is they're on social media. Like WGBH News has an education desk. Send them a note.
You can tweet some too.
You know?
They'll-
I think
yeah.
local news also speaks to the lack of diversity of gatekeepers. That's because there is no more local news.
And I can tell you that's definitely an issue that there aren't enough diverse gatekeepers. And I think, you know, again, you as citizens, as media makers, you have voices. All have voices. Use them. You're more educated than the average citizen. And so I think what you want to do is, you know, ask for more.
So I think we have to wrap it up. Thank you. Well,